Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest narration of the web series The Survivor Becomes a Dungeon. If you are new to the series, there is a playlist listed down below in the description. And as always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 158, Chris' Point of View. Vito's caravan has really grown into something of note. The group as a whole didn't leave until well into the afternoon, since the local elite decided to tag along. Thus, preparations needed to be arranged as luggage was packed, servants were selected to join, and a small squad of soldiers was tasked as escorts to follow along with the caravan as added security. The current plan was that the caravan would travel as far as they could before setting up camp for the night, and then the next day they would just cross through the next village without stopping for long, and setting up camp one more time on the road to the capital. From there, they would likely arrive in the capital before lunch, if all goes well, at least. Of the elite joining the caravan, the mayor, his wife, and their children decided to all come along due to some sort of meeting in the capital. Puma was also allowed to join the group, though Tulmi decided to stay behind to figuratively and literally hold the fort in the Lukfan family's place, with Aspen serving as her support. Beyond the elite entourage, Chris was vaguely surprised to see that they'd also be transporting some prisoners to the capital. It was the two foreign scouts that he had heard about during breakfast. Supposedly, they'll be brought before the Council of Elites or something, to be interrogated in front of everyone using undetermined means. Whatever was going to happen to them, Chris had a good feeling it wasn't going to be pleasant at all. So all in all, aside from the two carts they had started with, one more carriage for the elites will be added to the line, followed by a carriage for the servants, along with a chuck wagon with food and supplies for the trip, a small cart with a cage full of prisoners, and last but not least, the 8 soldiers on warbling swifts, who will ride along with the caravan. Chris, for his part, was in the cart he had been in before with the adventurers. Zax was the one driving today, while Riley rode with Lostrel in the following cart, letting him drive as she scribbled something down in some kind of journal. Sarah was currently using Chris's tail as a pillow, napping away the first leg of the journey, while Ren was playing a game of chess against Cecil, using that enchanted board. Though he could tell that the game wasn't really the focus, as Cecil kept getting distracted by explaining some sort of fundamentals about magic, and Ren was more than happy to listen to him ramble. Chris himself could barely understand the conversation altogether, though if Ren was getting something out of all of that, then more power to her. Looking around the cart, he noticed Rance and Lily were also sleeping the after-dinner away, the duo sitting mostly upright while leaning into each other as they slowly swayed while the caravan rolled along. Chris wasn't all too sure where Basmori was. Even Frady was somewhere else, as far as he could tell, though Lugosi was out amongst the warbler-riding soldiers as he decided to help out with searching the area while the group travelled. Looking back down along the line of carts and carriages, Chris spotted Wither sitting with the servants with a new plague doctor who showed up at some point in the day. From what Boss Vito had mentioned, the new one was a woman called Festa. Meanwhile, Blight had remained back in Lukfan's Rest with another new plague doctor, a man named Demise. Chris wasn't sure where they had come from, but he had learned that the boss had many more people working for him than he initially realized. To think that the Thieves' Guild had nothing on him when they tried to look him up the other day. All that power and that many subordinates all over the place. Just where did he come from? Speaking of the boss, the last Chris saw of him, he had gotten into the back of the cart Lostrel and Riley were driving, saying something about needing to meditate and asking not to be disturbed unless something serious happens. Regardless, with these many people around the caravan, there really wasn't all that much for Chris to do, so he opted to take a page out of Sarah's plans for the day and leaned back against the cart's wall, just shutting his eyes as he listened to Cecil and Ren talk and slowly coasting off to sleep. Vidmori Point of View. In a blink, I find myself back in my core chamber, the warm green glow of the core filling the room as I feel my senses practically explode with information of all the activity within my bubble. It was easy to forget just how much information I was able to easily process in general as a dungeon core when compared to the limited senses of my avatar. Feeling things out all over again, I began roaming my bubble of influence and checking in on things where I could. Moving down the smithy first, it was actually empty, much to my surprise. The forge itself still radiated heat, but as far as I can tell, it looks like nobody's been here for a few hours at least. Poking around a little more, I did spot a long and wrapped-up bundle that looked to be a spear. However, given that Tricia wasn't here, it wouldn't be right for me to just take the spear without giving her a chance to show it off to me. Leaving the smithy behind, I poked around the training room briefly to find that it was also empty, which made sense, I suppose. The sinners had already left before I did, and Dread was set on training with the spitter wolves while I was on my way out. Heading further down my mountain, I made my way into the 4 greenhouse rooms, and they were just bustling with activity, as a dozen or so borats slithered around the place, tending to the crops as they methodically checked each and every growing sprout or flowering vines and bushes. There weren't much by the way of weeds, or even pests, considering the rather isolated nature of the greenhouse, but they still managed to find things to do. I even spotted a few of borats just meditating among the crops, imitating ururu as they sat in coils while biting their tails, circulating their mana through their small bodies before sending that mana into the soil and crops around them. I didn't spot Frisbee anywhere in the greenhouse rooms, though I suppose she could be just busy elsewhere. Leaving the borats to their gardening, I headed further down my rather unused mountain and made my way into the Spitter Wolf den. In the entry chamber, I spotted the shooting range from before, though the layout of the targets had been rearranged since then. A few wolves were milling about here and there, seemingly resting or relaxing, while others were bringing in kills in the form of rodents like the rabbits or those oversized blue mantises. While I knew that wolves didn't need to eat to survive, quite a few of them felt the need to eat to fuel up because, they're not showing signs yet, but most of the female wolves are pregnant. The wolves themselves seemed to be aware of the pregnancies amongst their number. I suppose between their inborn instincts as well as their heightened awareness from their near sapience, they're bound to notice the changes in their own bodies as well as the others around them. Surprisingly enough, only around half of the females are pregnant, and this seems to be a conscious decision amongst them as they plan for a future and control their own population without any real outside guidance. Looking around, I spotted Garm amongst the wolves, who had been resting, and I could tell she was also pregnant, and had gotten physically bigger and stronger than when I'd last seen her. She wasn't quite as big as Lugosi, but she was a close second and distinctly bigger than the rest of the Spitter wolves. With my avatar as a guide for height, Lugosi, while on all fours, would reach up to just below my elbows. The Spitter wolves in general only reached up to around my hips for the most part, though now Garm seems to be somewhere in the middle. Now distinct enough to stand out amongst her subordinates, while still being somewhat smaller than Lugosi himself. I could tell that most of the activity around the den had already been discussed earlier in the day, and the general air around the den showed that there wasn't much to be concerned about. However, I do wonder how long ago the wolves as a pack had gotten busy, since at very least I didn't see any signs of that they were trying for pups before I'd left. Then again, I'd been pretty busy doing my own thing for the most part, and I wasn't actively paying attention to the wolves and their activities. Regardless, I let sleeping wolves lie and allowed Garm to maintain her rest while I made my way below my mountain. Going past the smithy and workshop, I ended up at the recreation of my old home and spotted Isak and Jody training in the ring I'd created in the middle of the road. The training in question looked brutal, at least at first glance. Isak just stood there in the middle of the ring, stripped off his armor and only wearing his pants as he held his arms outstretched to the point that they were level with his shoulders. While standing there, Jolie would lash out at him with 2 whips made entirely of water that repeatedly struck him as the water cracked and swooshed around him. She made sure not to strike the same place twice, distributing the apparent beating rather evenly across the young man's body. As I looked closer, I could see that the water whips were being repelled as they made contact with Isak's body, a thin and almost vague magical barrier helping to protect him against the attacks that Jody was bringing down against him. This must be that stone skin, or perhaps bark skin defense that Rionum had taught me about. The training itself went on for another 20 minutes while I helped myself to studying how Jolie and Isak used their mana, watching how it flowed around their bodies as they used it to manifest the water whips and defend against said whips. With the training over and done with for the time being, Isak immediately settled down on the ground, sitting with his legs crossed and lowering his head to start meditating and recovering his now exhausted mana heart. At the same time, Jolie was hopping the stone fencing to leave the training ring and make her way to the building they had been working out of. It was at that point I decided to make myself known, mentally reaching out and poking Jolie to at least try and warn her that she wasn't alone while I conjured a small ball of green light. "Hey there, Jolie. That was some intense-looking training just now for Isak. Is that how you were trained?" I asked pleasantly enough. I was trained using relatively rough methods when I was even younger than Isak and implemented a similar training regimen for those I was in charge of. I was curious if this was perhaps the norm in this world, or if this was something special. Jolie, for her part, still jumped at the sudden appearance of my voice in her mind as she instinctively looked over her shoulder before spotting the green ball of light and sighed to herself before offering me a smile.
"Oh, hey, V.R.E, I didn't know you were around," she mentioned at first before taking a moment to consider what I had asked her. "And yeah, that's pretty much how I was trained, though usually a second trainer is attacking from behind to help hone the apprentices' spatial awareness. That way they can learn to react to attacks they can't see coming," she explained rather dutifully with a small smile on her face. Making her way into the small building, she approached a small collection of bags and crates in the corner of the main room and began digging through them before procuring a bag of what looked like simple trail mix and a dense-looking piece of bread. On the other end of the room was a single drake that slept rather soundly, with the 3 eggs nestled safely between their wings and body, along with a generous amount of dry grass and some blankets that made up the veritable nesting area they had set up. "So what brings you by? Weren't you in the middle of travelling to the hegemonic capital? How's it going?" she asked pleasantly enough, while eagerly fishing for information beyond the mountain and this cave. "I'd say it's going pretty well. I've managed to ingratiate myself with some of the local elite, and they've decided to help me out with my investigation. I'm currently pretending to meditate in the back of a cart and decided to just check in on things around here," I explained, as I had my ball of light follow her back to the stone building, as she grabbed a couple water skins before going to rejoin Isak. "You're travelling with a whole caravan. How'd you manage that?"
she asked while setting the foodstuffs down on the stone bench that was along the sidewalk. "Oh, I earned favour for the mining guild master in Sunsmart Keep, though I'd rather not go into that just yet, since there was something I wanted to do first," I mentioned simply as my ball of light flits away from her, heading further up the road as I looked for the centre of the massive room. It was around then that Isak had decided to pipe up, having watched Jolie hold on one-sided conversation before seeing my ball of light go around the stone neighbourhood.
"V.R.E's back. Did something happen?"
he asked while speaking in a somewhat normal voice, apparently no longer needing to whisper as he got to his feet.
"I'm not sure,"
Jolie said as she passed him a chunk of hard bread while grabbing a palmful of trail mix. The duo watched on as I poured out some stone onto the middle of the room and began to shape a thick stone obelisk that was about 10 feet tall, suitably simple yet ominous.
"Now what's he doing?"
Isak asked as he looked at Jolie before taking a bite of the hard bread and easily chewing on it, despite the audible crunching that was sounding out.
"How am I supposed to know?"
Jolie replied with a glance before looking over to the ball of light as she approached the obelisk.
"Hey, V.R.E, what are you up to?"
I couldn't help but smile to myself as I polished the faces of the obelisk with my magic, making sure the edges are nice and pristine before reaching out to the 2 of them and speaking up. "I'm making a spawner. I had an idea while I was reading a book about dungeons yesterday and wanted to see if I was right."
"You can just make a spawner, just like that?"
Jolie asked with a surprised incredulousness about her as she looked at the obelisk over again with new appreciation, though Isak wasn't sure what to make of anything as he approached. "Well, I don't know how easy it is for a regular dungeon, but I had help from Revire and Rita in learning how they worked after we dream-walked always," I explained, while drawing out the necessary runes. "Is that a big deal?" Isak asked, while tapping his knuckle against the stone obelisk. Jolie had to actually think on that as she brought her hand to her chin while watching the runes be etched into the stone.
"Well, I'm not sure. An adolescent dungeon generally has a couple of main spawners where their scions emerge from, with few minor spawners around their territory for distributing monsters more easily. I'm no expert, but I do have some experience with shattering spawners. They look more like natural formations, usually growing out of a wall or from the ground. Then again, the only experience I've had with spawners are the murderous meat grinders. Maybe they look different with different kinds of dungeons, she considered while walking around the obelisk spawner. What are you going to do with this spawner, Vidmore? Are you going to make a new kind of monster or something?
Not exactly, no. I'm actually unable to do that just yet, since I only just spawned something new just over a week ago. There's apparently a cooldown period or a prerequisite I need to meet before I can do that again, I mentioned as I etched out the last of the runes.
Jody wasn't sure what to say in the face of that, though Isak piped up as he looked at my ball of light. So, what are you doing?
Oh, well, I read how murderous dungeons tend to have an excessive amount of undead in their surface, and are likely using the bodies of those who tried to crack them. Well, if other dungeons can use undead so readily, then the undead can likely respawn, right? I asked almost rhetorically, as I double-checked the rune work.
Based on the past experience, yeah, that sounds about right, Jolie readily responded with a slow nod.
Well, if that's the case, then if I tune my zombies to a spawner, they should be able to respawn too, I said before pulling out a black-skinned leaper from my storage, startling Jody as she suddenly took a few steps back while her hand quickly fell to the hilt of her blade. Though seeing as the leaper didn't do anything or even acknowledge her, she made an attempt to relax while watching it closely. I silently commanded the leaper to run their mana through the obelisk while I did the same, activating the spawner as a glowing crack formed on the obelisk. And there we go, I say, unable to contain my own excitement at their success. Well, now it is time for the test, I consider for a moment while looking at the leaper before turning my attention to Jody. Jody, do you mind killing my zombie? I need to make sure this works, I explained before looking at the leaper. Sorry about this. The leaper just gave a little shrug before looking at Jody with an expressionless face. All while, Jody just looked more than a little uncertain about this.
Are you sure, very well then, she said as she drew her blade, stepping up to the leaper while holding her blade at the ready. In the next moment, Jody slashed out at the leaper, cleanly taking off its head as it dropped like a sack of bricks, its head landing with a squishy dump thump on the stone beside it. I could feel the shift in the air as the mana travelled up to my core before being redistributed back down into the spawner. The respawn didn't happen right away, though while we watched and waited, I noticed the leaper's corpse start to fade into nothing, almost disintegrating into dust until all that was left were the blood stains. Jody, for her part, didn't look all that surprised by the event, so I suppose that was meant to happen. After another few minutes or so, a clawed hand suddenly reached out as a leaper grabbed at the edge of the crack before pulling itself out, still wearing the ruined clothes that it had before and looking no worse for wear. Interesting. So it retains the equipment it had on as well, I commented to Jolie and Isak, for no other reason than to give a mental voice to my observations. Fascinating,
Jolie finally said, as she looked over the leaper curiously.
You really just made a spawner just like that. Well, congrats on the success, Vidmore. Was there anything else that you were wanting to do while you were here?
She asked while looking over at my ball of light. Well, aside from tuning the rest of my zombies, not much else, I said while I started pulling out the other zombies I'd freshly made since last night.
The rest?
Isak asked after a moment, though he soon found himself going quiet as he watched the horde of 152 zombies slowly pour out of thin air. End of chapter. I would just quickly like to thank the T5 peeps: Dragon Soup, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Sevaren Serberous, Red Panda 121, Leslie 517, Bushmaster 177, Casper Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Sans the Skeleton, Light Jock, Dragzoon W.R.E, and Lord Asrigal. Thank you very much.